Hello and welcome to this episode on the real story of Braveheart. As always, well, not as always on this particular program, but today we are, of course, joined by my wonderful Scottish co-host, Columba. Hello.
Hello, Your Majesty. It's good. It's good to be here. I'm sure. I'm sure you're
That's
gonna
Lord,
love this one.
that's Lord Paramount of Scotland to you, sir. Thank you very
Indeed,
much.
indeed, indeed.
Wonderful. So we have Scottish representation here, and of course English representation. So everyone should be wonderfully happy and satisfied by the presentation.
Except the Welsh and the Irish, but you know.
I have a bit of Irish in me as well, so that's covered. But no Welsh. So anyone particularly.
Thank God.
Oh dear. anyone, anyone who has a gripe against Longshanks for the old, conquest of Wales back in the 1280s, then sorry, there won't be any Welsh representation, but that's fine because we're talking about Scotland. So the way we're going to structure this for this evening essentially is obviously I've got the picture of the Mel Gibson portrayal, which is going to be very different to most of our conversations. We covered it a little bit when we talked about Thomas More, when we went over a little bit of the fictional portrayals of Thomas More and how they compare to the real figure. Well, I would say roughly half of this is going to be debunking all of the historical claims made by that ridiculous film. and
yes,
the
there's
other
a lot
half
of
will be
debunking that needs to be done.
yes, and the other half will be going over a bit of the historical context and the actual history, as the title of this stream suggests. So, without further ado, we'll get to the historical background. And Columba, you want to start with Athelstan regarding the background to the Anglo-Scottish conflict.
Yes, sure thing. So, I would like to begin by talking about a Scottish king, and in the early sort of Middle Ages, in this period, many of the Scottish kings you don't really need to know about. I mean, Scotland at this point wasn't even the kingdom or the nation that we think of today. I mean, the entire Outer Hebrides, the Western Islands, the Northern Islands, Orkney, Shetland, and they were all held by the Vikings. You had the kingdom of the Isles and what have you, and then you had the kingdom of Strathclyde in the southwest. So it was a very divided and chaotic place, and there were the people in the west, where the word Scotland comes from. They were sort of Gaelic, and then you had Picts, and then you had Germanic influence as well, and so it was a real hodgepodge. But one king which really who really comes through in this period has been quite a notable man. He reigned for a very long time, especially considering the standards of the period, was Constantine II, and he was crowned at Scone, which was the it's kind of like the Scottish equivalent of Rheims, in 906. And around the same time as this, you have Athelstan in England. And England at this point, you had still had the Heptarchy not that long ago, Wessex and the differing kingdoms, but it had all been mostly brought under the control of Athelstan by this time, and he was a very powerful king. He had fought off the Vikings and retaken much of Northumbria from the Danes and what have you. So they begin to war because Athelstan is a sort of I suppose he might, in some sense, he got carried away with his successes, and he wants a unified Britain under his rule, and so he takes the fight north to Scotland and launches an invasion. It goes very well because, as I've said, the Scottish situation at the time is totally chaotic, and they're up against a, relatively speaking, very unified and well organized force. So there are a couple of skirmishes fought. Scottish forces retreat. They're broken, and eventually the Scottish king takes refuge at Dunatar Castle, near Aberdeen today. And Dunatar, it's a sort of outcrop of rock, essentially. And it was very heavily fortified, and Athelstan didn't have much of a chance of taking it. But likewise, Constantine didn't have much of a chance of getting out of this situation. And so essentially he arranged a deal with Athelstan where he would acknowledge Athelstan as his overlord. He would acknowledge that in exchange for being let go and being able to keep his crown. But this is another trend which we'll see, and we're always talking about this on the show, is that we have these patterns in history. And what happens is, of course, Constantine makes this deal with Athelstan, and the Scottish nobles aren't happy at all. They lose a lot of respect for him, and you get some sort of small rebellions happening, and there's extreme pressure put on Constantine to renounce this deal that he has made with Athelstan. And so desperate does the situation become for Constantine, because he has to win a victory, that he actually allies with the Vikings, who have been a terror to everyone pretty much. And with the Vikings, and I believe a contingent, because you've got to remember at this time the Vikings have small kingdoms on the east coast of Ireland as well, you know, especially around Dublin. You have the Kingdom of Dublin. And so the combined Irish, who again, they have a lot of relations with the Scots and the Vikings, this army sweeps south into England, I think in 937. And then you had a terrible battle, which is actually not very well known at all. You know, people talk about Hastings and what have you, but you had the Battle of Bruinborough in 937, which was a horrific battle. I mean, there were tens of thousands of men there, so it was a vast battle by the standards of the time. And there were Welsh, there were Irish, there were pretty much representatives from every sort of people in the British Isles. And I have here a quote from the Annals of Ulster, which describes the battle as a great battle, lamentable and terrible, was cruelly fought, in which fell uncounted thousands of the Northmen, and on the other side a multitude of Saxons fell. But Athelstan, the king of the Saxons, obtained a great victory. Now, I think they're maybe going a bit far when they say a great victory, because, and again, a lot of the history is sort of spotty, but Athelstan seems to have made no real ground after this battle. I think we could call it a Pyrrhic victory, or Pyrrhic victory. And this is very key, because Athelstan had a lot of momentum behind him at the time, and this battle was so vicious, and there were such high casualties on both sides, that it seems to have stopped that and broke his momentum, and also, you know, retained Scottish independence and the independence of the peoples of the North from English domination. But the very important precedent of overlordship had been had come to the fore for the first time. Constantine had sworn loyalty to Athelstan, and this was a precedent that English kings would draw on for a very long time. What have I got next here? Yes, here we go. So now we're going to fast forward a little bit. Well, I say a little bit, a long time indeed. And we come to the Anarchy. Now, AM, would you like to give us a little bit of the background on the Anarchy for the viewers?
Well, there's something I just want to comment regarding
Sure.
Athelstan. I think it's important to note that when we're talking about the early prehistory of Scotland, even the geography we're talking about, is not recognizable. Like the Kingdom of Northumbria encompassed most of what we would now consider the lowlands, and the Scottish border, you know, what we would even consider it today, isn't really formalized until the 13th century. And cities such as Berwick upon Tweed keep switching
Changing hands,
between
yeah.
English and Scottish, and in some cases it was even sort of semi-independent. So I think it's important to note that this is also the creation of a Scottish kingdom and an English kingdom at the same time, whilst also being, you know, this aggrandizement of all the, you know, previously sort of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In this case, you know, the Kingdom of Wessex, which was, you know, stabilized under the reign of Alfred the Great and enlarged to become the Kingdom of England by 927 under Athelstan. So it's, you know, into this context, you mentioned we want to establish the Anarchy. Well, if you want to sort of me to explain the Anarchy from the English point of view, well, of course, you know, William the Conqueror has taken over England in 1066 and established the Norman dynasty. Henry I, one of the more competent of the early English kings, dies in 1135. His son and heir had died a few years before during a sailing trip back from France. And we have this.
Oh yes, the famous white ship, the
and we have
yes.
Yes, and we have this 20-year civil war from roughly 1135 until 1154, where it is the daughter of Henry I, the Empress Matilda, and the imported French king Stephen of Blois, who are fighting over contention of England. But in terms of like how this relates to the Scottish throne in particular, I won't be able to say that. I mean, I can very much sort of tell you how the wars of Henry II impact the also how this is the beginning of the old alliance again between France and Scotland, comes just slightly after we have the end of the Anarchy in 1154 and the creation of the Angevin Empire under Henry II, Count of Anjou, and then later, of course, King of England, Duke of Aquitaine through his wife Eleanor.
I would say the most important impact from the perspective that we're looking at tonight of the Anarchy is, I mean the clue's in the name, but I mean this was a very prolonged period of civil war in England, and many institutions were broken down. There was severe economic chaos, total political chaos. The lords didn't know who to fight for, and what have you. And in this this climate of extreme instability, the Scots to the north were doing relatively well. I mean they still had to deal with the Viking kingdom of the Isles at this point, but the kingdom of Strathclyde, which it was a Brythonic kingdom in the southwest of Scotland, which was independent, had been incorporated into the kingdom of the Scots at this point. And so Scotland was consolidated.
The kingdom of Strathclyde, just for reference, roughly corresponds to the Western Lowlands.
Yes, the Western Lowlands, the very southwest of Scotland. And so the Scottish king at this time, David I, manages to take advantage of the situation, essentially, and he moves south into Northumberland and lays claim. And Northumberland, for perhaps our American viewers, it comes from north of the Humber River, if I'm not mistaken, and it had a long history as an English kingdom that had been set up after the Anglo-Saxon migrations and what have you. But David I sweeps south and lays claim to much of Northumberland. David I, by the way, was a very important king in Scottish history, because he, by the standards of the time, modernized much of Scotland, we might say. I mean, he was the one who established, the borough system, regional markets, and economic matters like this. He brought in a lot of the Gregorian reform, established monasteries,
and of course, very important to note in this Davidian revolution is also the importation of French-style feudalism and many French-sounding, knights and institutions.
Yes, many Norman knights were incorporated into it and were a huge part of this system, and that's why later on, I mean, the Bruce, famously, I mean, his name is Roger de Bruce, I mean, it's a Norman name, an Anglo-Norman name, and so there's a lot of this going on. So yeah, he was very important, and he laid claim to a large swath of this land. But of course, Henry II eventually wins out, and I think does he marry Matilda AM?
Henry II, no, Matilda is his mother.
Oh yes, of course. Sorry, but
that would be a little strange. But
yes, be a little strange.
Yes, sadly for Scotland, David dies 1 year before the Anarchy ends in 1154, and of course the Anarchy is ended by Henry II claiming the throne of England, undisputed now. After the death of Stephen of Blois, and of course, as we mentioned, setting up this new English empire. The son of David, King Malcolm, dies very shortly afterwards, and here we get to the longest reigning independent king of Scotland, William the Lion. What is significant about William the Lion, and again putting this into a broader context, which is going to be pivotal for understanding the story of Braveheart. At the same time, you're having a very ambitious king put on the throne of Scotland, who's wanting to, as you mentioned, expand further into Northumbria and push the Scottish border.
He wants to. I suppose he's thinking of the conquests of his grandfather David, and he wants to emulate it. He wants to retake these lands that he thinks are his.
Yes, and keep pushing the border as far south as you can. Henry is embroiled in a constant series of civil wars with his own sons and with his own wife. And one of the first things that William does upon inheriting the throne is he forms the first formal alliance between France and Scotland. Of course, France is the perennial foe of King Henry II.
I mean, France is essentially behind this rebellion in many ways, because you have is it Philip the Fair, who is the king of France at the time?
No, this is Philip the Fair is much later. This is Louis VII.
Louis VII. Sorry, yes,
yeah.
Forgive me. But there's a lot of disagreements, because of course Henry II is in control of a vast swath of territory in France at the time. Places like Aquitaine, which of course Henry's son Richard wants to be independent and in control of. And these sorts of efforts are supported by his mother Eleanor, but also the French king, because, I mean, for obvious reasons, I suppose.
And of course, pivotally, the Scottish king as well. I mean, the Scottish king as part, I mean, in terms of like the ambitions of Henry II, we already mentioned how he established an empire in France, but he was also the first king of England to actually conquer most of Ireland at the same time, in
Yes.
preparation for his eventual conquest of Wales. So Henry II was one of the most powerful and ambitious of all the English kings, and William the Lion would have been very aware that Scotland's future basically hung in the balance. So he would exploit any opportunity to weaken the authority of Henry II, and of course that came in the revolts of Henry II's children against him. And this is where we get to the Battle of Alnwick, which is a complete disaster. And William
Yes,
is
it's remarkable. It's remarkable how a king like William, who comes across as quite reckless, managed to stay on the throne for so long.
yes, well, this happens quite a few times where a Scottish king will meet his death on the battlefield against the English. Nevertheless, at Alnwick, he survives. He is captured, and here we have
Yeah,
the treaty.
he leads a very reckless charge. Apparently, he leads his cavalry, and I think one of the chroniclers says that he screamed out, "Now we shall see who is a goodly knight." And so there's this sort of perhaps, I mean, because he was quite young at the time as well, I believe, and he was influenced by I don't know, these ideals of chivalry and what have you, which were, of course, at this time reaching the peak of their popularity. I already mentioned Richard I, who is also around at this time.
Yes, and the king is still Henry II, and it's Henry II who concludes the Treaty of Falaise with William the Lion. And this is basically a formalization of the process you've been talking about, which began with Athelstan, which is the formal subordination of the Kingdom of Scotland to the King of England as Lord Paramount, essentially.
Yes, he also sends his men to occupy many of the large towns and not cities, I suppose, at this point, but yeah, the large settlements of Scotland. He sends his men and his captains, and the indemnity that he forces on William is huge as well. It's an annual sum of 40,000 merks. A merk is like a mark, which also shows the Germanic influence, and that's like 26,000 pounds sterling. And of course, a pound being a pound of weight at this point, so it's a vast quantity, and of course, it can't really be paid.
and of course, he also tries to subordinate all the Kirk, the church in Scotland, again to the
Yes, he
Archbishop
does.
of Canterbury in England. So all of these elements, these consistent attempts to subjugate the Kingdom of Scotland,
and the Scottish Church had been increasingly formalized under David and under William. I mean, the Scottish Church essentially started with my namesake, Columba, and the Abbey of Iona in the west, in the Western Isles, and it was very heavily influenced by the Irish Catholic culture and the old culture, the culture that produced the Book of Kells and what have you. But at this point, the religious momentum has sort of shifted east to places like St Andrews.
Yes, and in terms of, you mentioned Richard the Lionheart, when Henry II finally dies in 1189, Richard the Lionheart is actually quite an opportunity for the much diminished and humbled William the Lion, because of course Richard the Lionheart is primarily concerned with crusade, and of course when he returns from the crusade he is captured and held for ransom. And so during this time William the Lion also tries to purchase his claims over Northumbria and try and buy his way out of the Treaty of Falaise, which to some extent he actually is successful regarding the Treaty of Falaise. So we're talking about this you can say this back and forth, this constant toing and froing regarding the actual formal subjugation of
but
the
it's not only the crusade and the desire for money, because yes, you're right. I think 10,000 merks are offered to Richard for him to revoke this treaty and these claims. But not only that, William the Lion had been sort of embroiled in a contest with the Pope at the time, Pope Alexander, because he wanted to appoint one of his favorites as a bishop, and the Pope wanted another man. But eventually they managed to settle this, and the details aren't exactly clear, but it resulted in a papal bull, which basically stated that the Scottish Church was independent. Well, not independent, subject to the Pope, but not subject to the English Church. And so Richard had this papal pressure on him as well when he went back on the treaty.
Yes, and of course, William dies in 1214, around the same time that John is facing the complete unraveling of the Angevin Empire, the loss of all of these territories in France. Nevertheless, John does lead several punitive campaigns against the Scots to prevent William using this opportunity to destabilize the situation in the north. However, when we have the next king, Alexander II, the son of William the Lion, Alexander II is very gung-ho for defending this, alliance between the French. So much so that he raids as far south as I believe it's Dover. He actually reaches in terms of his
and
raids
some
into
of
English
these
territory.
again, this sort of goes against the Braveheart narrative. Some of these, I mean, on both sides, these sackings and these raids that are going on are extremely vicious. I mean, in many cases, the Scots are stealing a vast quantity and taking it back north
Well,
as
we're
well,
talking
be
about
it
the
gold or
we're talking about the
cattle.
complete destabilization of England and the loss of its I hate to say imperial possessions, but its dynastic possessions over across in France. And Alexander II is at a point where he can actually conclude, and he actually pays homage to I believe it's Louis VIII, the son of Philip II August, to acknowledge him as King of France. However, of course, this all ends when you have the death of John Lackland and the acceptance of Henry III as the King of England, and the Scottish adventure sort of ends, and they return back to Scotland. And Alexander II, I believe, he's the king who confirms the boundary between England and Scotland, and he also leads, as you mentioned, punitive campaigns against the Kingdom of the Isles and against the continuation of Viking presence, now Danish influence, in the Scottish Isles, even though that'll continue until I think the
it continues
16th
until
century.
Well, yes, I suppose you still have intermittent raids, but the sort of domination of the north by the Vikings in Scotland really ended under Alexander III, who we'll get to next. He won a battle against King Hakon of Norway. Quite a lucky battle. I believe that there was a sudden storm or wind, and it threw off many of the Viking ships, and it didn't allow them to reinforce or something like that. And what happened is that the King of Norway, Hakon, ceded the Western Isles and the Northern Isles to the Kingdom of Scotland, in addition for the Scottish king paying an annual sum in silver to the Norwegian king. And at this point, you're getting the true consolidation of the Scottish kingdom. And relatively speaking to what had come before, vast material prosperity as well. You're getting
That's something very important to note. At the same time, we're having, again, I'm assuming that most people in the audience have watched Braveheart or are aware of Braveheart.
If you're not, why are you here?
the Braveheart narrative from the beginning paints this completely fallacious idea of Scotland being pillaged and ruined by the English. I believe there's even a quote at one point during the Battle of Stirling, as opposed to the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where Mel Gibson goes up to the English representative and says, we want you to leave and pay reparations for like 100 years of torment. And like, Scotland during the reign of Alexander III was prosperous, whereas under Henry III in England was disintegrating. You were having the Barons' Revolt. At one point it was looking like he was going to be dethroned. In fact, many points it looked like Henry III was going to be dethroned. He was one of the most ineffective kings of England, and again, roughly contemporaneous to Alexander III. So Scotland was actually doing relatively well economically and militarily compared to England, which was disintegrating.
Their trade relations were really taking off, especially with I mean Flanders and the I don't know if the Hanseatic League at this point. You had the wool trade, especially which the Scots were a huge part of, supplying wool. Of course, that would come back to bite us when we were all turfed off our land for sheep. But that's a couple centuries later, to say the least.
Oh yes. And this gets us to the meat and bones of this discussion, which is
the great matter.
The great matter, the great cause. How do we get to the story of Braveheart? Well, of course, Edward I comes to the throne of England in 1272, and he has witnessed this, continued decline, in particular, at the hands of de Montfort and the various barons' rebellions against Henry III. And he becomes king in 1272, very much aware of his rights as king, and he is wanting to undo all of the, you can say, nearly a century's worth of damage to the monarchy, which had been encountered under his two incompetent predecessors.
Yeah, a century of opportunism, we might say.
So what he does is he stabilizes royal authority. He is actually in many ways responsible for the creation of the modern English constitution with the model parliament. And of course, he is famous for the conquest of the Welsh, again using a similar pretext of acknowledging the Welsh acknowledging the formal supremacy of the English crown. And when this is ignored, Longshanks launched a punitive campaign against the independent principality of Llewellyn in Wales and destroys it and establishes a series of very powerful castles in Carnarvon, etc., to cement English authority in the West forever. And of course, this then becomes the Principality of Wales. And the whole concept of Welsh as wedded to the dynasty of England begins with Edward Longshanks as he's trying to build and consolidate.
And he gets his son to administer it, right? Does he not?
Yes, exactly. That's the whole concept of the Prince of Wales. It's setting up Wales as basically a court to establish the prince in preparation for ruling England as a whole, which is the origin of the Principality of Wales. And
quite a wise policy.
Yes, a very wise policy. So in many senses, Edward is one of the greatest kings of England, and
he is ruthless, though. That is one thing that the film gets.
Oh, absolutely right. Ruthless. I mean, he's ruthless in putting down the rebellions in Wales. And I think talking about the Welsh conflict is important to note for when we get to the origins story of William Wallace, because this is when we get to the situation in England. 14 years into the reign of Edward I, we have the death of Alexander III. And this spawns a huge issue in Scotland because
would you like me to explain how that happened to the audience?
The death of Alexander III. I believe he fell from a horse, didn't he?
Yes. He was in Edinburgh. Apparently, he was at a feast and he was having a jolly old time with his magnates. And he had recently contracted a marriage with I think a French princess, actually, and her name was Yolande of de Dreux. Like half his age, this beautiful young French princess, and she's up in Forfar.
Well, Yolande de Dreux sounds more Breton rather than French.
I couldn't say. I need to check that. I apologize, but anyways,
yes, she was the Duchess Consort of Brittany. So yes.
Oh, there we go. So contrary to the advice of his attendants, he decides he's going to ride out that night from Edinburgh and cross over into Fife to, I suppose, consummate this marriage. And it's an extremely stormy evening, terrible weather. He has to sort of argue with the ferryman to get him across. And as he's riding, he is detached from his party somehow in the chaos and in the weather, and he rides his horse off of a cliff, and he dies, and he doesn't have an immediate successor. The closest you can get to is his granddaughter Margaret, who has been married into Norway, hence the name Margaret the Maid of Norway. Now Margaret is a child at the time, and she is recalled from Norway to try and establish some sort of regency in Scotland. But unfortunately, she becomes ill on the journey and dies. And this is when we get into the great matter of the succession.
Yes, and she, of course, dies in 1290. And from this point on, we have, I believe, 13 or 14 claimants.
13, yeah.
All claiming some sort of distant connection with some sort of ancestry to David in particular, and of the two,
and it's quite difficult because I mean the history of Scottish kingship is very confusing even for Scotsmen to look at. I mean there are multiple different families, and there are all sorts of strange precedents and links that people have, and so it's just a highly competitive atmosphere. Yeah.
Yes, but the two most prominent houses are the House of Bruce and the House of Balliol, and it looks pretty obvious that due to the fact that all of these claims are very distant and rather spurious, that Alexander III had no sort of real close heir, that this would lead to a civil war within Scotland. So rather than allow this to happen, they make the poor decision in hindsight, to appeal to Longshanks, Edward I, to intervene in the affairs of the Kingdom of Scotland and arbitrate this dispute between principally the House of Bruce and the House of Balliol. How, of course, Edward I is using this attempt to, as we mentioned, what is the overriding sort of concern of Edward I? It is it is ensuring that all of the claims, the claims which have basically been abandoned.
He doesn't want a repeat of the Henrys, essentially.
He doesn't want a repeat of his father Henry III or of King John. He's wanting to confirm his rule over all of Britain and establish again the lapsed supremacy of England over Scotland since the Treaty of Falaise, and the supremacy under Henry II. And in order, for this whole process of arbitration to go forward, he declares that all the Scots have to acknowledge him as Lord Paramount. In the case of the nobles and leading churchmen, they have to pay homage to him directly. And in the case of many other Scots, they actually have to go to various centres, churches, centres of administration, and swear their loyalty to Edward as Lord Paramount. In return, he would oversee again the election of a king. And of course, the issue is he's also bringing up troops as well to support this claim to supremacy over Scotland.
Yes, I think he actually brings up troops whilst they're holding court in Berwick upon Tweed. Whilst they are deliberating and deciding these things, he's already moving troops, which gives you an insight into his character.
So this isn't an altruistic attempt. It's definitely an attempt to confirm this master-vassal relationship over Scotland, which
But again, there's no sort of absolute moral weight to the Scottish side, because as we've established, you've had over a century, many centuries of Scottish opportunism as well. One can hardly knock him if you consider.
Well, no, and of course, as we mentioned, there are so many precedents for this. Dating back, in this case, over 300 years of English supremacy. So from Edward's point of view, you can almost look at him as some sort of Aurelian type figure, the restorer of the world. He's simply trying to restore English suzerainty over the British Isles. And of course, he's thinking at the same time, what is his primary goal, you can say, as king in terms of military affairs? You can say Wales and Scotland are just an afterthought for his main consideration, which is the restoration of his lands in France, in particular Aquitaine. So he wants to stabilize the situation in Britain in order to focus on a future war with Philip IV for France. And of course,
we must remember as well. I mean, there are these realpolitik considerations, if we might say. War with France. He needs support. He can't have an enemy at his back. But at the same time, I mean, we've had Richard the Lionheart previously, and Richard the Lionheart was absolutely obsessed with chivalry, and I believe he even he bought a sword and took it on crusade that was supposed to have been the sword of Arthur, and so there, and of course Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing in the late 1100s as well, and you have the history of the kings of Britain, these stories of Arthur, these stories of a king of Britain, a unified Britain, and so there are these sorts of romantic notions flowing around as well, which no doubt played their part.
Absolutely, and the king who is ultimately elected as King of Scotland as a result of the arbitration is John Balliol over the House of Bruce.
Old Toom Tabard.
Yes, the weak, or rather the unfortunate John Balliol. And John Balliol is again forced into this formal position of vassalage thanks to Edward's interference. Again, this is really important to understand in terms of the setting up the war, and how you could say that Edward had more than enough of a casus belli to invade Scotland in 1296. In 1294, Philip IV, who in theory was the liege of Edward over Aquitaine, his possession in France, forfeited the territory, and trying to use it as an excuse again to seize back the last vestige of English authority in France and claim it, so that all of France would be united under the French king. There'll be no foreign interference, and the legacy of the Angevin Empire will be put to bed. At the same time, the nobles in Scotland are pressuring John Balliol to conclude a treaty with Philip IV, an alliance whereby the military cause of Scotland and France would go hand in hand. Yes. If ever Edward wanted to launch a preemptive attack against Philip.
And the nobles have been growing increasingly dissatisfied with the situation, and kind of like what we saw with Constantine centuries earlier. They're dissatisfied with the diminished position of their king. There's even sort of in some ways it's a matter of prestige. I mean Edward does treat Balliol like a total vassal. He even Balliol has a complaint about something. I think land was taken off of him by some opportunistic noble, and Edward forces him to complain about it in a common court as a plaintiff. you know, like anyone would have to do. And so there are all these insults building up. But in addition to that, in the intervening period between John Balliol's accession and Alexander and Margaret's death, you had the guardianship of Scotland set up, whereby the nobles ruled Scotland as a council. And of course, as we see in history, when people get a taste of a certain sort of power or a new way of doing things, that taste stays, right? And so these disagreements continue until eventually, I believe in 1294, there's some debate around this, but some people say that the guardians of Scotland were the ones who contracted the alliance with France, without John Balliol's strict consent. So at this point, Balliol, not only was he being humiliated by Edward, but he was being he was getting the runaround from his own nobility.
Yes, and of course, this alliance with France precipitates the war, and it's the Scottish who, interestingly, lead the first attack in 1295, a year after these negotiations. Edward begins preparing for an eventual invasion of Scotland because, of course, his worst nightmares come to fruition. His main aim is detaching Scotland or making Scotland contribute to a war in France. Now it looks like they're going to ally with France against England, so he needs to launch a preemptive strike against it to prevent again all his territory in France being lost. At the same time, the nobles in Scotland plan and operate a preemptive strike into England, into Carlisle Castle, and it's quite interesting that I believe Robert Bruce, the father of King Robert I, the Bruce, was actually the English governor of Carlisle Castle. And again, one of the policies of Edward I, of course, was to award, again, something which is actually accurate in the film, is to award certain titles and certain possessions south of the border to try and make the nobility of Scotland feel, again, that they're going to lose a certain amount of prestige and power if they risk, rebellion against Longshanks.
To try to sort of intermingle and make them dependent. Yes. Certainly.
So the Lord of Annandale is the governor of Carlisle, and the Scottish attack Carlisle, and this is the perfect pretext for Edward to begin his invasion of Scotland proper. Now he has the casus belli to do so. At the same time, the situation in France is stagnating. No side is winning either side, and I believe he actually concludes a temporary truce with France at the same time, allowing him basically to concentrate all of his efforts against Scotland. And of course, Philip IV betrays his Scottish allies. So this whole alliance with France from the beginning, the old alliance, is actually sort of undone by the treachery of Philip IV.
I mean, even then, it never sort of materializes into much, even at the best of times.
No, absolutely. So Edward begins this by sacking Berwick upon Tweed, which was one of the largest market towns in Scotland at this point.
And it was absolutely ruthless. I mean, of course, the chroniclers can't always be believed, but even the English chroniclers describe it as being particularly brutal. The River Tweed ran red with blood, and there's even a story that apparently Edward only relented, and because he had ordered them no mercy, and his men had begun to shout havoc, which is where we get the word from. Basically means lay waste, and one of the chroniclers says that he only stopped the assault and he only stopped the sack after 3 days when he saw one of his men slay a pregnant woman. Take that how you will, but clearly it was an extremely vicious sack.
The irony of this, of course, being that this is probably one of the only sort of atrocities committed by Edward during this time against the civilian population, and it doesn't actually feature in Braveheart.
yes. Instead, they come up with this
incomplete inventions. But of course, from the victory at Berwick, we have the Battle of Dunbar, which defeats John Balliol, and John Balliol is taken back as a prisoner. First of all, he's in the Tower of London, then finally he goes into exile to his French estates in Scotland. But nevertheless, in France, he remains an important political consideration, even though he's not
for years.
He's not formally reigning as King of Scotland. But until we have the murder of John Cumberland in 1306. He remains, in theory at least, the de facto the jure King of Scotland. So he's still an important consideration. He doesn't just disappear after the defeat at Dunbar.
But he is utterly humiliated. I mean, there's a ceremony which I think is it at Carlisle Castle or Newcastle, where they dress up John Balliol in the royal coat of arms of Scotland, and they emblazon it on his surcoat. And then one of Edward's in attendance as well. And whilst Edward is seated on the throne, Balliol in front of him, Edward orders one of his barons to come up to John Balliol and rip the coat of arms with the jewels off of his surcoat and throw it on the floor. And this is where his nickname in Scotland, Tomb Tabard, comes from, which essentially means, empty coat or blank coat, Tomb Tabard. And he's utterly humiliated.
And of course, this is important for Edward, because Edward has tried ruling with a proxy, and the proxy has proven unreliable. So now he's going to have to deal with the Scottish nobles directly. And again, just removing the coat, the royal coat, the royal tabard, is a impressive symbolic act in terms of unmaking a king and elevating Edward.
Just to say, by the way, it wasn't at Carlisle; it was at Montrose where this happened.
Yes, sorry, I didn't know. So thank you for that, Columba. And of course, one of the other symbolic acts is, of course, removing the Stone of Destiny from the church at Scone, which, as you mentioned, was the equivalent of the coronation town for the Scottish kings.
Yes,
moving this,
you would stick one of your feet under one of the crevices in the stone, and you would be coronated. And it had a very long history. The first king of Alba, Kenneth MacAlpin, was supposedly used this stone, and so it had a very strong link to the concept of Scottish kingship, and it was actually taken and put under the throne of Edward, right?
The coronation chair, and it was used for all subsequent coronations, even the coronation of Elizabeth II, who of course is still, even if not titularly, Queen of Scotland. So all of these conscious elements to unmake, you could say, an independent kingdom of Scotland and move all these symbols down to Westminster, down to England, are established by King Edward. And this is where we get to my favorite part of this discussion, which is going to be tearing apart Braveheart. So you can see here, I've included a still from the beginning of the film. And the beginning of the film starts out saying, "Historians from England will call me a liar, but history is made by those who have hanged heroes." Now, look at the date, 1280. This is the date in the film where they claim Alexander III dies. So right from the beginning, they've even got the date wrong. I mean, no one even cared to even look up whether there was any sort of historical continuity.
It's not by like a year.
It's 6 years. But also, but it's worse than that. It's worse than that, because then the film sets up this ridiculous narrative where William Wallace. We'll get into the origin of William Wallace, but William Wallace either had two fathers. Sir Malcolm Wallace, if you believe Blind Harry's account in the Wallace, or Alan Wallace, who is actually mentioned in official records we have with Wallace and the Hanseatic League.
Alan Wallace is mentioned in the Ragman Rolls, which is essentially in 1296. Edward, after he's humiliated Balliol, he has a document drawn up listing all of the landholders and nobles in Scotland, and there's a reference on there to a crown tenant by the name of Alan Wallace, and this is the same one that's talked about in the Chronicles.
Yes, and the idea again is that Alan Wallace was a minor noble. But then what does the film do? The film sets up this bleak beginning, with all these beautiful picturesque Highland shots, where the impression is that Scotland has been under the evil yoke of England for decades and decades now. I mean, the first introduction of the film is that the Scottish nobles were brought by Longshanks, a cruel pagan. I mean, this man fought on crusade. He's one of the greatest sort of lawgivers in English history. The idea that he was a pagan by any estimate is just absolute nonsense. But going on from that, they set up this you can say this conflation of the meeting whereby Edward confirmed John Balliol as king. John Balliol isn't even mentioned in the film, by the way, and they take this completely fictitious event, which is mentioned in the Wallace, which is the Barns of Ayr, in which supposedly the Sheriff of Ayr, the Bryce of Blair, etc., all of these nobles were killed, even though there's no historical evidence to prove this.
Yes, this comes from, as you said, Blind Harry, who was a sort of poet, and he was writing in the 1400s, and indeed, if you read his poem, which is quite difficult even for me. I don't mean that to be arrogant, but just because it's very heavily Scots, but it's clearly influenced by Chaucer, and it's that sort of world, and yeah, there's all sorts of incredible tales in there.
Well, yes, I mean, just in terms of the language, the actual full name of the poem is The Actus and Dedus of the Illustri und Valiant Compagnon, Sheer William Wallace.
I love it. I love it.
Obviously, the acts and deeds of the illustrious and valiant champions of William Wallace. And, what this account, in terms of making this account the basis of the film, the issue with this account is that it was intentionally made as a xenophobic anti-English propaganda piece to try and undermine the authority of then King of Scotland, Alexander III, some 200 years.
James the Third. No,
sorry, James III. Yes, sorry, James III. So again, it was used as an anti-English piece back then, and of course, Braveheart you could see has the exact same function nowadays. But nevertheless, in terms of setting up the introductions to this film, we have the fictional Barnes of Ayr moment, which again is from the film's narrative. It's sort of trying to imply that this was also the event in which Edward held all the the election of the Kingdom of Scotland, and of course that is a completely different event. But if this event,
it combines them together to make a sort of red wedding, I suppose.
Yes, it combines. Yes, absolutely. It combines these two elements together. One completely fictional event and completely obscuring the actual historical event, and it puts it 20 years before if it ever happened. If it ever could have possibly happened, it would have happened around the year 1296, not in 1280. So it establishes. I mean, the only reason it's 1280 is because if William Wallace was born around the year,
it's a nice round number.
Well, no, there's a worse reason for that. William Wallace was born roughly in around 1270. So the William Wallace established here is 10 when he goes around the Barnes of Ayr, and his fictionalized father, who of course is a commoner, and again there's a class element which I couldn't help noticing again in this anti-Scottish noble angle. The commoner Wallace, the son of Malcolm Wallace, of course, goes off, as a result of the prompting of the Barnes of Ayr, a fictional incident in Blind Harry's account, to go and fight off the English, despite the fact Alexander III was alive and well at this time, and Scotland was in peace and prosperity. So yes,
it's clearly with regards to the class, we talked about this briefly before we came on, and it's so comparable to you can tell he's so clearly influenced by American Jeffersonian ideals of the sort of the virtuous smallholder who just wants to live in peace.
I think it's more than that. You mentioned that to me earlier, but I think it's the fact that it wasn't even enough. Even in Blind Harry's account, he's a noble. In all of the historical accounts, he's a noble. But the fact he can't even be a noble, the fact he has to be your common peasant man, the fact, again, inexplicably, he has an uncle who can teach him French and Latin and can teach him to be, a warrior, when again this was impossible for a commoner, essentially.
That's also absurd, because I mean the best evidence tells us that he was a noble, but not only that, he was part of this new sort of Scoto-Anglo-Norman.
Yes.
So the idea that
there's even a Welsh attribution to him as well.
Well, yeah, but the idea that he would even need to be taught French. I mean, in likelihood, his family probably spoke French.
Yes, exactly. It's the first language. But of course, he has to be taught French because he's a commoner, and there's no way he would have taught French in everyday parlance. And as you mentioned, the idea of the Scottish nobility speaking French is something that would have happened under David I. So this is all, completely ridiculous, and it sets up this completely ridiculous backstory when Mel Gibson, who's been supposedly traveling the world, comes back. Inexplicably, he comes back to this nowhere village in the Highlands, which is incredibly poor and barely developed, and it's here that he wants to marry his childhood sweetheart, to create this incredibly sympathetic yet incredibly stupid backstory with which he can then have all the motivation he needs to wreak havoc on these evil, dastardly supervillain English. It's incredible.
And with regards to that story about his love, Mirren or Marion, there's two theories about this, because the first, there's a couple of manuscripts of Blind Harry's The Wallace, and in the first one, or the earliest rather, one that we have, there's no mention of this Marion, and then about a century later, she's mentioned in the manuscript. Now, one school of thought holds that there was, because she's given a second name, which I can't for the life of me
Marion
remember. Braveheart, that's it. One school of thought is that this family, to either aggrandize themselves or to lay claim to something, had her added as a sort of, oh look, our ancestor was, in love with the Wallace or what have you. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is that you know, once you get to the 1400s, all of these stories have become very famous. Down in England, we have stories of, you know, Robin Hood, who, I mean, the best evidence suggests that, again, there was a historical figure. But of course, it's blown wildly out of proportion. And famously, we have the Maid Marian, you know, his lady love. And so some people think that it might have been a sort of storytelling attempt to turn William Wallace into a sort of Scottish version of Robin Hood, you know, and to bring in these romantic ideas of a Maid Marian, which, you know, if that is true, then it's very, it's not very innovative. You could have at least picked a different name, guys. You know?
No, I think it makes sense though, and I think again, there's also this idea that the character was invented. So I think one Scottish clan tried to claim to be the descendants of this fictional character to try and claim some sort of a illustrious connection back to William Wallace. So again, this is entirely, you know, fictional. You know, this character was invented 100 years even after the fictionalized account of the Wallace in the 16th century. So all of these elements of the early life which are depicted in the film are complete nonsense. I mean, just in terms of moving on to the origin story of William Wallace, it is more than likely, I mean, he had an archer's seal because, of course, he was a noble. So the likelihood is that he had actually served fighting with the English, it must be noted, in Wales during the 20 or so years of conflict in which Edward was establishing, you know, full control over the principality,
yes,
and that he was probably trained as a longbowman.
It's funny though, English historians say that, but then many Scottish historians, and I've been checking this out, they say that the reason there's the bow on his coat of arms is because he was a keen hunter, which I love. That was funny.
Yes, but I mean, just in terms of like establishing why he would have done this, I mean, the assumption again is that because we barely know anything about him before the action at Lanark, so the assumption is that he was a minor, you know, a lesser son of Alan Wallace, who was himself a minor noble. So when you have a junior son who isn't going to inherit, you know, the meager possessions of Alan Wallace, what do? You either go and become like a warrior adventurer, or, you know, a mercenary, or, you know, join up and become a knight for a king, or you go off and join the church. Of course, you know, William Wallace, you know, becomes an adventurer. He joins in the conscription forces of ironically, Edward Longshanks, and fights alongside him. It's probably, again, to explain the military success of Wallace and his military innovations at Stirling Bridge. It makes quite a lot of sense. But going back to the film, because, you know, the corresponding, you know, beginning of this is what we have in London to establish Longshanks, who, in fairness to the film, I actually love Patrick McGowan's portrayal of Longshanks, despite the fact
it's good fun, isn't it?
It is ridiculous. So I'm more than happy to wear his likeness as my avatar today. You know, the problem with Scotland is that it's full of Scots. I love his portrayal, but nevertheless, the beginning of the film is, again, just complete nonsense. It starts off assuming, you know, this is a couple of, you know.
Oh wait, is this when his son is giving the eyes to his?
No,
to
it's
his
worse than that.
It's worse than
that. It's worse than that. I mean, obviously, anyone who knows anything about Henry II knows about Piers Gaveston and the fact that he died through having a instrument placed up his arse because of his supposed acts of sodomy. But nevertheless, if you want the impression that he was gay, it's really obvious during this marriage ceremony, which again has to be noted, it happened in 1308. It happened a year after Edward had died. It happened 3 years after William Wallace had died. This is all complete nonsense. I mean, there's even a line at the beginning that says, again, insinuating that Edward II was gay, that Edward Longshanks would do the deed himself. Well, she was about 6 years old at this point. But more than that, it was him getting married during this time, not his son. He was marrying the sister of Philip IV, Margaret, in 1299. So it's his wedding, not the wedding of his son. And for some reason, they have to establish, and again, I know the reason, because obviously the film has a seriously anti-English element to it. They have to bring in this mature version of Isabella France, who, funnily enough, is the sort of character, had she been old enough to probably have an affair with Braveheart. But that's sort of beyond the point. The issue is that why is she established in the film? is it just so Mel Gibson can imply that Edward III was in reality the bastard son of William Wallace? That seems to me the only reason as to why she was included in the film.
I think you're giving him motives that are too highfalutin, my friend. I think it might have been so that they could shoot a particular scene in the film.
But it didn't have to be Isabel of France. They could have just made Margaret of France younger and done that. It's the fact that it's Isabel of France, the mother of one of the greatest kings of England, and the insinuation again that Edward II never conceived and never consummated the marriage. So again, I think the insinuation is obvious that they're just trying to set up. Again, this is all nonsense. I don't even know why we're spending so much time on this, because the point is that all of this is wrong. There is nothing about this which is true. And of course, this leads to another scene in the film where we have the famous prima nocta scene, which I mentioned.
I can imagine how apoplectic you were getting watching.
If we can't sort of wipe them out, we'll breathe them out. I mean, for goodness sake, prima nocta, the only sort of modern this comes from a Scottish historian writing roughly 250 years after, one Hector Boucher. But this was like almost a complete invention in terms of this, being an actual right. And had it existed at all as a right, it wasn't in any way sort of a license for sexual proclivities, because that would have just caused, again, first of all, it would have caused a war between the nobility and the Catholic Church, but it would also cause a war between the peasants and the nobles, because they had every justification to turn against their lord. The likelihood is that it was actually some form of financial dispensation to engage in sexual proclivities at a certain time. It wasn't a noble's right to go around and take the virginity of all the commoners' wives. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. But of course, he takes this myth that was actually, promoted by others like Voltaire in the 18th century to characterize the Enlightenment, to characterize the medieval era as thoroughly debauched and completely beyond saving. The only sort of modern anthropologist that I could actually point to who actually defends this relatively modern 19th century is Friedrich Engels. Again, that weird Marxist element seeping into this narrative, this anti-medieval element here. But of course, this again is to set up the English as irredeemably evil. The fact they're wanting basically to use the English nobility to have sexual proclivities with the ordinary sort of fair maidens of Scotland.
Yes, they're eugenicists at this time.
Yes, precisely. It's just beyond insane. Of course, this all sets up the situation where we finally get to the action of Lanark, which is by, of course, Marion, or rather in the film, Muddin, has to marry William Wallace, or rather Mel Gibson, in private, and of course leading to some promiscuous scenes within the film. And from that, of course, the insinuation is one of the English soldiers takes a liking to her, and this of course leads to the incident with which she has her bloody hell, her neck,
it's like she's tied to a post and has her throat cut. Yes,
and of course this gives him all the motivation he needs. The innocent William Wallace, who's come back just to have to lead a farm, raise a family, have children with his sweetheart Muddin, and come back and have this
but again, there are opportunities. There are examples of, even if you want to villainize the English, there are examples where Edward was very ruthless. We mentioned the sack of Berwick. Not only is that not really shown, but also, there's a particular episode in the sack of Berwick where there was a tower of, I think, Flemish merchants or something, and they were holding out, shooting arrows from the tower, and they ended up killing one of Edward's cousins. And so when this tower was taken, apparently Edward took the men and burned them alive. These are the sort of the things that you could go for, but instead he makes up all of this romantic claptrap.
Yeah, I'm trying to think why they didn't do it, because I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe if you establish the sack of Berwick, you'll have to again abandon the notion that Scotland has been oppressed for decades, if not centuries.
Yes,
then again, just make it up like Barnes of Ayr. Say it's 30 years before the events of the film, rather than 1 year before the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Why not? You made everything else up, so just do that. But nevertheless, we finally get back into the actual history, as opposed to this complete and utter fantasy, which is the film of Braveheart, which is the action of Lanark. Do you have any sort of, because again, the action of Lanark and the motivations behind it? This is what
there's not a lot known.
William Wallace, to being basically a noteworthy military figure. Do you have any explanation other than, of course, we have the fictionalized sort of Marion Braveheart account, and of course we have the idea even that he was resisting the magistrate because he'd actually been a petty criminal.
Yes, this is the only other explanation that I could offer, and it certainly doesn't paint him in a very good light. Yes, there's a record, I believe, of him. It's really not very edifying, but there's a record of or a report of William Wallace and an English knight stealing a barrel of beer. And then getting into trouble because of this, and so there's this idea that he's a sort of criminal and he's fallen afoul of the law, and perhaps things got out of hand and they ended up killing him. But certainly it's not this chivalrous attempt to save his love. There's no evidence. That story comes from centuries later, and the original event is sort of shrouded in mystery, although there are subtle clues that William Wallace, as you say, was a sort of had fallen afoul of the law at this time, and he was a bit of a criminal.
Yes, and I want to add a character which the film Braveheart omits entirely, which is his historical comrade in arms, which is Andrew Murray.
Yes.
Andrew Murray had fought at the Battle of Dunbar. Unlike William Wallace, he was an established noble. He had escaped later that year, and he had already been leading a rebellion in Moray and the north of Scotland, just south of Inverness. So even before the action of Lanark, Andrew Murray is making a name for himself as one of the first independence fighters against and in terms of just what are the implications of what is the type of rule? We've already mentioned the symbolic elements, the stone of destiny being moved south to Westminster. Well, Edward Longshanks establishes a Justinia in Scone, and Scone basically becomes the center of the English administration with an English Justicia and all these English elements, these English sheriffs, etc., English magistrates. Basically, for all intents and purposes, Scotland has been de facto included into the Kingdom of England, as there is no Kingdom of Scotland and there is an English administration. But right from the beginning, we have Andrew Murray, who had a established history of fighting against the English, leading a rebellion in the north. And what you can say about Lanark is that Lanark simply complements this rather than being the initial spark as portrayed in that film.
Yes, I suppose one could hypothesize that perhaps the action at Lanark took place because Wallace and perhaps a couple of other minor nobles or perhaps commoners had heard of what was going on in the north, wanted to kick off. That would just be an idea that's come to me now, but of course it's all guesswork. But yes, this is because I don't find myself getting particularly angry about things like dates, although it's still remarkable just how wrong they get it. But one thing that really does irk me is the contributions of men like Murray, which are totally ignored, even though he was a very brave man, and the evidence seems to suggest key for Wallace's success. He was a very well experienced fighter, and Wallace at this point was only 25. He was quite young. The evidence suggests that he was probably quite charismatic, but quite young and quite inexperienced.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the implication of Lanark, I believe the immediate effect of Lanark is that it brings the Douglas clan into supporting the source of independence, and combine that with the intervention of Murray. A lot of the Scottish nobles begin to try and negotiate with Longshanks for improved terms, as opposed to their new settlement with him. And this goes on for many months throughout the end of 1296 and 1297, while this domestic campaign, being launched principally by Wallace and Murray, is gaining ground. And it's here where you have the younger Robert the Bruce beginning to take an active interest in the affairs of Scotland. And this is another betrayal which is absurd in the film, talking about the original portrayal of Robert the Bruce, who is one of the most effective yet vicious kings in Scottish history, and he's portrayed as this reluctant tragic
simpering sort of posh boy, dressed in furs.
Yes, it's simply a matter, again, I think, Gibson taking out in the aristocracy, if only this man had the bravery and the ruthlessness and the tenacity of William Wallace, then he would be the ideal king. And of course the ridiculous revisionism when it comes to Bannockburn at the end, but just ignoring that. And all of these elements, depict Bruce as, basically this king in waiting. Everyone sort of expected him to be king, but he simply doesn't have the charisma. He simply doesn't have the belief. And it's William Wallace that gives him this belief. No, right from the beginning, Robert the Bruce is angling to undermine any attempt to restore John Balliol, who again is not mentioned at all in the film, because that would make everything confused. He is not this reluctant person who is all expected to be king. He is deliberately during this time undermining any attempt to restore John Balliol.
This is the man who later on kills his rival in a church.
Yes, this is John Comyn. I mean, John Comyn is basically the great rival of Robert the Bruce during this point, and John Comyn takes on the pro Balliol cause after, of course, Balliol is basically exiled to France. And just in terms of mentioning that, he murders his rival John Comyn in a church in Dumfries, and this is the event which he uses basically to crown himself as King of Scotland. The brutal murder of his rival before the altar.
I think he ends up getting excommunicated as well.
Yes, exactly. So, but again, just the complete contrast between this and the fictionalized portrayal of Robert the Bruce, this ruthless, aspiring dynast who's wanted to establish a new dynasty of Scottish kings with him as the first king, as opposed to his father. I mean, for some reason in the film, his father is portrayed as a leper.
Yes, I love that. I totally forgot about that. Yeah, his dad's a leper.
There's no evidence for that at all. The only sort of
more evidence that Hollywood directors are pretty much always physiognomy pilled.
But the ironic thing is that Robert the Bruce was more like that than his father was portrayed, essentially, in terms of his vicious scheming and his allying temporarily with the English if it got him some sort of temporary advantage for his overall goal, which was the acquisition of the Kingdom of Scotland. And this betrayal, why does he have to be a leper? Why does he have to be this deformed creature? Because you could say he's like the pure Machiavellian element of the terrible betrayal of the Scottish nobility as entirely self-serving. And all I can see that as some sort of metaphor for you could say the moral bankruptcy, the fact that the Scottish nobility are more than willing to sell out their nation to England. I can't think of any other reason why they betray him as a leper and why they give him so much of Robert the Bruce's personality or less. I mean,
they do this a lot. I mean, when we get to Falkirk, we can expand on this treatment of the nobles as well.
Well, we have to get to Stirling first, which, yes. I mean, for any military historians watching the Battle of Stirling Bridge, it must be noted, they must get an aneurysm. I mean, there are things mentioned like the fact, kilts, of course, weren't used by the Scots at the time, and the fact that they didn't use Pictish blue paint and all that sort of rubbish. But
it's more than that, because essentially, would you like me to go over Stirling Bridge briefly, or would you like to get us there?
Yes, well, I mean that's just the superficial elements of the film. But the fundamental thing about Stirling Bridge, of course, is that Stirling Bridge is, first of all, the English are now responding. Edward is, of course, back in France, fighting this, renewed conflict, which isn't going to be, formally simmer down until 1299 and again in 1304. So I believe it's the Earl of Surrey. Who sends his forces north to engage the Scottish at Stirling, and in order to cross over,
it's John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, yes, and he's sent north, and they meet at Stirling, and of course this is Stirling's a very important location in Scotland, because if you want to, I mean, the English already had a lot of control in the south, and so they want to push north into the Highlands where a lot of this stuff is going on. And at Stirling, it was one of the only crosses on a sort of narrow isthmus, perhaps we could call it that, into the Highlands. And so the English force has to cross the river at Stirling. And the bridge from which the battle's Stirling Bridge, it's a key part of the battle as well. It's not as if there was a bridge there and Gibson chose to ignore it.
The crucial point of
essential.
Well, the crucial point of this bridge is that only 3 men, roughly, abreast could actually go along it. So it was this incredibly arduous process to take an army over 10,000 men and slowly you have this river crossing.
But it's worse. It's even worse than this, because what ends up happening is that so rivers, of course, bend and curve, and dear listeners, if you can imagine, when you get to a large sharp bend in the river, you have basically an upside down U on a map, perhaps. Now, on the right side of that U, we would have Stirling Bridge, and Edward's army, or the English army, is on the opposite side, and they want to cross over to the north side. And as you mentioned, it's a very narrow bridge. Perhaps 3 men can cross. Now, what ends up happening is that William Wallace and Andrew Murray and the Scots wait in the high land, not that far to the north, and they don't really show themselves. They don't engage, and they allow about a third of the English army over the bridge. And this third that is crossed over, this contingent, it is inside the U of the bend. And so if they turn around, they see the bridge, which is absolutely full of their men crossing over, and they see the river and the muddy ground. Now, once this third had crossed over, Wallace and Murray gave the order to charge and to attack. And so all of the English are penned in this little piece of land, and they can't get back over the bridge. And the knights, of course, they're in heavy armor, they have barding, and so they can't get over the water. And the Scots are using schiltrons as well, which is basically a pike wall of pikes and sticks of differing lengths, and so
kind of like a phalanx, isn't it?
Yes, essentially. And the Earl of Surrey, Warren, he orders a cavalry charge to try and break through the Scots and get the English out of this situation. But the Scots put up the schiltrons, and what ends up happening is that the cavalry are broken. No, sorry, the infantry charge. The infantry are broken by the pikes, and then the infantry end up running back in chaos, in retreat, into the English cavalry who are trying to push forward, and it's just a total bloodbath. I mean, men getting thrown from their horses and cut to pieces. It's
men desperately
really
trying to swim back over the river.
Yes,
again, and they're drowning in their armor. Yeah,
it's a really ugly and unedifying scene, and so you can understand Gibson's trying to make out Wallace to be this noble warrior, whereas by the chivalric notions of the time, I mean you couldn't get more dishonorable. I mean it's extremely intelligent, and it's an excellent use of the landscape, and he clearly knows what he's doing. Wallace and Murray know what they're doing, but yes, it's not a very honourable or edifying sight for the Scots. It's very opportunistic and vicious, and it just doesn't come out in the film at all. In the film, it's made out that they lined up, and then
I really want to get into this.
Against the cavalry, but they won because I don't know, the Lord favoured them or something.
Well, of course, Andrew Murray, of course, dies during this battle as well, which is a huge blow very early on to the cause of Scottish independence. And all of this is omitted from the film, maybe because Mel Gibson, in addition to being the lead actor, is also the director, and he didn't want anyone taking the spotlight away from him. The fact that this was a collaborative effort, not a sole effort by William Wallace in the form of his erstwhile ally Andrew Murray, who died at this battle. But in terms of just the military tactics of the fictional battle, the element it's made so clever. The fact the English think the cavalry is going to go away, so they're going to send their cavalry in unsupported to charge at the Scottish pikes. I mean, for what? What is this utter nonsense? I mean, the cavalry attack at the actual Battle of Stirling Bridge was out of pure desperation, and the cavalry didn't have this, strategic advantage. I mean, they basically had flat land. They had all the strategic advantage they need. They could just, again, use longbows to whittle down the English forces, the Scottish forces, until they were annihilated. But of course, the reason that the Scottish won with far inferior numbers, and again, potentially, a lower quality of troops and armaments, is due to the element of surprise and due to them attacking this at this fundamental choke point. Whereas in the battle, even watching it, I don't even understand how the Scottish were able to win. I don't. There's no sort of great tactical push. They're all just fighting manically. You have this ridiculous.
The two sides just run at each other as well. I love. You have
this ridiculous beginning. I remember at the beginning of the Scottish nobles, of course, you have to get a little dig in against the Scottish nobles. Edward is trying to undermine the Scottish party by saying, the Scottish nobles aren't charismatic enough to keep these men in order. They just all want to go home. Well, in that situation, I would go home because there was no chance they could have possibly won that battle. But anyway, William Wallace comes up, and he comes up with these ridiculous sort of anti-English speeches. And the English representative,
take our lives,
but the English representative there, he starts laughing laughing at him. And the funny thing is, it's meant to portray the English as some sort of, cruel, oh, they don't care about their supposed crimes. That's just me laughing at these ridiculous claims made by this madman looking like a pagan. And, with this tiny little ragtag force, which has no chance of winning. But because of movie magic and because of Mel Gibson's charisma, it just wins that battle. It's so completely insulting. And it takes away from the interesting character that is William Wallace, because William Wallace won that battle through tactical strategic brilliance, as opposed to just standing there and giving a ridiculous speech like a Hollywood A-lister.
Oh, and don't forget lifting your kilt up and showing your private
but that's another element, the consistent element. They get the Irish bloke in who says, do I get a chance to kill Englishmen? It's just, what is this? There's just constant, we have to constantly show, oh, we're defying the English, we're humiliating the English. I mean, who cares? They just fire an arrow into your arse, and that happens continuously. They shouldn't be caring. I mean, and of course, they made the Earl of Surrey into some sort of, idiot as well, in order to justify the stupidity of the English. So it's the stupidity of the English and the inexplicable charisma and, I don't know, divine providence and freedom being on the side of the Scots that wins the day. Therefore, the whole achievement of William Wallace, the supreme achievement of William Wallace and Andrew Murray, which is the Battle of Stirling Bridge, is completely lost in the execution of the film. And this is where we get to the aftermath, in which he's immediately knighted and made the Guardian of Scotland. The idea that a commoner would be made Guardian of Scotland is completely ridiculous, even under those circumstances. The reason he was, and of course, he invades England before he becomes the Guardian of Scotland, and of course he does not sack the city of York, for goodness sake.
York is like many miles south of where he actually raided.
He raids into Newcastle and Carlisle and Northern Cumbria. He doesn't go 100 miles into York and sack the biggest city in Northern England. And there's this moment, of course, another ridiculous scene in that film where Edward comes back. There's this pre-Piers Gaveston, called Philip, and he throws him out of the window for daring to try and stand up to the king. Again, just utter insanity. And then he says, oh no, the William Wallace can attack lower. No, he never even got below Carlisle, for goodness sake.
I mean if they were laying siege to York, where is the English relief? Or did they take York in a night?
Well, it seems that way, and of course, just the king's cousin. He cut the heads off of Scottish women. What is this? Every Englishman has to be an evil bastard, and even though that, why would the governor of York have anything to do with Scotland? It's hundreds of miles away, for goodness sake. It makes absolutely no sense. But anyway, we have the end of that, and in reality, William Wallace is then made the Guardian of Scotland, and again he uses his the House of Wallace, his sigil, that's where we get the element of the archer, to begin negotiating trade contracts with the Hanseatic League, and of course trying to bring the French back on side.
There's a letter extant from William Wallace to Lubeck, I think. Yeah,
Lubeck, of course, being the main city in the Hanseatic League. So all of these elements, I mean, it's just such an interesting comparison, looking at this, great military tactician, lower noble, and that's
another thing. I mean, his rise to becoming Guardian would already be quite impressive.
Exactly.
He was a minor noble, a second son.
So what the film does, is takes this brilliant man and makes his backstory impossible. I just find that ridiculous. I mean, I can't even understand what is going through Mel Gibson's mind to justify all of these bizarre choices, which any sort of sane
It's because
person...
he's trying to appeal to the American plebeian. Yeah. I'm telling you, that's the reason. He has to be a commoner. Because I don't know, many Americans seem to have a sort of inferiority complex in that.
Most of the yes, I'm sure the 2,000 Scottish nobles would be very happy at the fact they were being usurped by a commoner. But of course, this ends in Falkirk, and of course the next invasion of Scotland. Would you like to go over the details of the actual Battle of Falkirk? Because in fairness to the film, even though many of the elements of the Battle of Falkirk in that film are fictional, ridiculous, especially the Irish changing sides at the beginning of the battle. Yes. It is still more or less roughly representative of what happened, with a couple of exceptions. More accurate,
yes.
So would you like to go over that?
Sure. So essentially what happens is, after the raids, Edward, I think he either negotiates in France or he finishes his business in France, and he comes back over and raises a very large army. thousands of horse, and then I think there's something like 10,000 Welshmen in the army as well, and then there are Irish contingents which are drawn as well. And he essentially starts to chase Wallace, because Wallace, again, being a very intelligent and seemingly very capable general at this point, he's learning, and he knows the landscape, and he knows that with this large army, all he needs to do is just continually retreat and evade and try and starve the army, essentially discontent the army, and force them to head back south to resupply. Edward at this point had sort of moved his court and his administration up to York, actually, and then in Edinburgh as well. He had forces organized there, and so he's chasing Wallace, and Wallace is refusing to give battle. The situation actually becomes quite not desperate, but very difficult for Edward. There's actually a small mutiny amongst, I think, the Welsh contingent in his army, which he has to put down, essentially using his English troops. And so the situation is becoming frustrating for Edward in the extreme, until he hears that the Scottish force have settled down at Falkirk. They're encamped at Falkirk, and he rushes there with his army on a forced march to try and catch them, and catch them he does. And so the situation is, you have a small river between the two armies, and the Scottish army is far smaller. And so what happens is, you have the Scottish arranged in their schiltrons, these sort of pike walls, these sort of hedgehogs, if you will, with archers interspersed among them, a small number of archers, and 600, maybe 500 Scottish horse behind the schiltrons. The idea being that they would be able to somehow hold off the English cavalry. But of course, what ends up happening is that the English cavalry utterly, and Edward is personally present at this battle as well, directing things. There's no such sort of, that you see this scene in the film where the Irish and the Scots sort of, are going to fight, but then they all start shaking hands and they're friends. Nothing like that happened. Essentially what happened is, Edward sent his cavalry around the schiltrons on both sides, began to engage, and the Scottish nobles did flee. And not because they had made any sort of deal or anything like this, but simply because the situation was untenable. You had thousands of horse coming from either side, putting extreme pressure on them, and they simply weren't able to hold. They were getting slaughtered. And so what happens is, once the Scottish horse is gone, the English horse come behind the Scottish, begin to attack them, and then Edward moves up his longbowmen. And the Scots are still entrenched in these schiltrons, which are designed to hold off cavalry and infantry. But Edward simply, like you said, as he could do, barring any, problems with terrain or any interesting strategic decisions on behalf of the Scots, Edward moves up his longbowmen, surrounds the Scottish schiltrons, and simply just orders them to fire. And they fire all day, and it's an absolute massacre, a terrible defeat for the Scots. And that's the Battle of Falkirk. Essentially, it's a crushing defeat, and it's not because he was betrayed, and he was betrayed by Robert the Bruiser, or all of this. It's because they were simply outdone.
That stupid element where he is standing by the king, dressed up in this armor,
with a big helmet on, so you can't see him.
He charges alone against William Wallace. So you can have this ridiculous element where, oh no, he was the chosen one. He was
you were supposed to bring balance to the force.
What's the quote? I can't remember anyway. You were supposed to bring balance to the force. You were supposed to destroy this. You were supposed to destroy the Sith, not join them. Anyway, the ridiculous element, which we see the personal betrayal of Robert the Bruce, which makes absolutely no sense. He does betray Scotland, not William Wallace personally, much later, which we'll now get into, which is the interesting thing of what happened to William Wallace after this. Well, first of all, he was already in an incredibly tenuous position regarding his claim to the guardianship of Scotland, which was basically
his guardianship. Again, the idea of a commoner being a guardian is absurd. But no, even the idea of a noble as minor as himself, there would still have been a lot of contention, and really his position totally relied on the prestige that he had gained after Stirling.
Absolutely, it was the military prestige as a result of that victory, and of course, all of that is evaporated after Falkirk. As long, kind of like a Napoleon figure, so long as he continues to win battles and cover himself in glory, he had the impetus to maintain some sort of nominal headship over Scotland. But this is lost, and he has to defer back to the two principal nobles, which of course are Robert the Bruce and John Comyn. And of course, there is this other ridiculous scene in Braveheart where he goes on this vengeance spree, where you have all the Scottish nobles dreaming about him.
That is my favorite scene in that film, where he bursts into the nobleman's bedroom on a horse with a flail. With a flail. I love it. You can't say it's not entertaining.
And how he was dreaming of Mel Gibson, strewn in blood and blue face paint, charging towards him. Then he wakes up
wild-eyed, yes.
Utterly insane. And of course, how one of the dead bodies just falls, onto Robert the Bruce's, dinner table right in front of him. It's just all of this
because they're all living together in like one house. Apparently, the nobles in Scotland.
There's just one element, and of course what happens after this? Well, William Wallace, despite this horrific sort of military sort of prowess he's been exhibiting with Mel Gibson's portrayal, he actually then becomes a diplomat. And again, we've already mentioned the historical precedent of him being a diplomat when we talk about his attempt to try and get Hanseatic League support behind independent Scotland. And of course, the French support is key in order for Scotland to have any sort of independence. I mean, in terms of what Robert the Bruce is aiming for, Robert the Bruce clearly wants to be King of Scotland. And so he's now left in this impossible position where his nominal rival, John Comyn, is in a joint guardianship with him. And they're basically at the point, kind of like what we had before the election of John Balliol, where the Bruces and now the Comyn faction want to cause
You're on the verge of civil war again.
They're on the verge of civil war again.
And this is a theme which comes through, and it's not very edifying to the Scots. Is that really? I mean, one of the main stumbling blocks for the Scots is constant infighting and constant vying for supremacy. Because of course we've had a royal house being pretty much extinguished, and so this stuff is almost inevitable in the feudal period, unfortunately. But again, it's made out to be all the result of the evil machinations of Edward and what.
But this is a dynastic conflict. This is again something completely missing from the film, which is John Balliol is still considered the king by many Scots. Many Scots believe they're fighting for the reign of John Balliol. And again, it's just a king is not like a president. When you have been consecrated as king, when you have been anointed as king, the conception is that you cannot be unmade as king, even if you're forced, to abdicate your throne or, to be humiliated in the way that John Balliol is. The idea that John Balliol is the king is still resonant in the minds of many Scots. So when it comes to the conflict between Comyn and Robert the Bruce, it is not this, these evil Scottish nobles trying to betray the notion of Scottish nationality. Robert the Bruce wants to become king, and Comyn is standing for the rights of the already existent king, John Balliol. So it's much more, and again, this entire element completely absent from the film. But as we mentioned, what does William Wallace become? For the next 6 years or so, he becomes a constant bane of contention for Edward, in terms of the symbolic defeat at Stirling Bridge.
Quite widely. Yes.
But he becomes basically a diplomat. And of course, you mentioned papal interference going back all the way to the 12th century. Well, of course, the papacy sides again with the independent Scottish, even signs an encyclical, Scimus Filii, to support the independence of the Kingdom of Scotland at the expense of Edward's continuous campaigns. I mean, this is quite an interesting facet of Edward. Is at the beginning of his reign, Edward is considered one of the leading lights in Christendom. He went on crusade and promised to take the cross upon becoming king. He never does so. And yet, after we have, you can say the death of his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, we have this change, whereby, he's viewed, as opposed to this, diplomatic arbiter, this chivalric king. He then becomes, in the eyes of most European kings, an oppressive tyrant, especially because Philip IV basically has, supreme influence over the papacy at this point.
Yes, that was a point I was going to make. And that goes back to, if our listeners can remember, when we were talking about the Avignon papacy and what have you, and had Owen ap Griffith in Wales leading a rebellion. He sides with the French side. The Scots do as well, and that's why you're getting these sorts of papal bulls put out to benefit the Scots.
So what we're trying to illustrate is that the conflict of Scotland has to be seen in this wider context between the overall geostrategic situation in Europe as a whole. When Philip IV, we mentioned on a previous stream, the House of Capet, was one of the most you could say ambitious of all the French kings. He wanted to exert not only dominance over France, which had been, hitherto divided into all of these ducal regimes, and the actual royal possessions of France were relatively minuscule until we have the rise of the Capetian dynasty in the 13th century. Philip IV had destroyed the Knights Templar, or will destroy the Knights Templar, not quite at this period. Philip IV brings the Avignon papacy into existence after, basically extinguishing the life of Boniface VIII. Philip IV tries to make Charles de Valois, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He has, again, ambitions for this unified Christian empire under his control, essentially. And
yes,
Edward
he's famously ruthless. I mean, what is it? Le Roi de Fer, the Iron King. Yes.
And Edward, who is again the equivalent of Philip IV, existing contemporaneously with him in England, is a constant source of embarrassment for him. The fact that Philip IV still has to contend with the English king controlling such a vast area of France is, of course, a constant source of embarrassment. So all of these elements are at play here, and of course, all of these elements are missing from the actual story of the film. I mean, just trying to remember what happened in the film. I watched it last night, so I should remember. I think it's because I was so apoplectic, I just stopped paying attention.
Foaming at the mouth.
But he sort of, becomes like a wild animal after Falkirk. He sort of becomes, a hit and run sort of guerrilla fighter, trying to cajole the remaining Scots nobles, back into
he's
fighting.
Like a sort of Osama McLaden or something.
Yes, all he needs is a cave to hide in, and this is where we get to the more interesting thing, which is what is actually happening. Edward is continuously invading Scotland. He invades Scotland more than half a dozen times during this period, and this puts a huge amount of strain under the actual leaders of Scotland during this period, which is Comyn and Robert de Bruce. And as we mentioned, the situation is already tense, so much so that a bishop is actually made a third Guardian of Wales in order to prevent a outright civil war between the two. And in 1302, Robert the Bruce then defects to Edward, as opposed to the ridiculous defection we see in the film. And he does this again for the simple reason that he is losing too much of his wealth and too many of his levies, too many of his feudal vassals in this, what he considered to be a hopeless cause, fighting for the cause of another king, which is John Balliol. So he defects to the English in 1302. And from William Wallace's side, this is a much more, you can say, severe betrayal of him, because William Wallace, of course, is desperately trying to find a diplomatic solution to this. And when we have the defection of Robert the Bruce, it really seems that the Scottish cause is basically over. And Philip IV, again, who's, as we've mentioned consistently, always been willing to betray the Scots if it wasn't immediately advantageous to him. The whole notion of peace sort of dies by 1304, and from 1304 Edward begins consolidating his renewed control over Scotland from 1304 until 1306, with John Comyn basically ruling Scotland as his viceroy, is now the Guardian of Scotland, whilst Robert the Bruce is again entering into this bitter rivalry with Comyn, which will culminate in the Dumfries incident, in which he murders him in cold blood in front of an altar of all places, just showing how vicious this character is in comparison to the fictionalized betrayal of him. Now we get to the actual capture and the execution of William Wallace. Would you like to go into the details of that?
You know what? I have actually, I can't remember the exact circumstances around his capture in the actual history. I only remember the absurd account in the film where isn't he invited to sort of he's invited to Edinburgh to deal with the nobles or for his position to be reinstated, and unknown to the Bruce, who at this point has had a change of heart, the English are waiting for him or something like this. I do think he did come back to Scotland, and he was betrayed by by a noble or somebody who was
Yes,
harboring
he
him
was
to the
betrayed.
English.
He was betrayed by one John de Menteith, and
That's his name, John de Menteith. Yes,
in,
but this idea that it's this Robert the Bruce didn't know, and he's sort of literally grabbing the English soldiers and saying, leave him alone.
no.
It's absurd. I love it.
But again, just the pathetic, simpering betrayal of Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce, who is more than aware of what's going on,
Yes.
and would easily betray William Wallace to gain advantage in that situation.
Yes, in a heartbeat.
In a heartbeat. And of course, it's left to Lord Annandale, his leper father, who was ultimately, the reason behind this, which again is, completely ridiculous. But yes, the reason for this is that in 1304 we have the, you could say, the formal acknowledgement by John Comyn the Red, again acknowledging the Edwardian, conquest of Scotland at this point. And one of the elements of this treaty, which, among other things, Comyn is trying to preserve as much of the independent institutions of Scotland as possible, is that he has to give up William Wallace. However, John Comyn makes no active effort to achieve this. So it's actually, as we mentioned, done by a Scottish knight, John de Menteith.
And the reason why he doesn't make a lot of active efforts is because there is still some residual affection for Wallace, despite his defeat at Falkirk, and it probably wouldn't play that well.
And of course, the reason for this, again, because Edward is a cunning and incredibly, ruthless and effective king. As with John Balliol, as with the Stone of Destiny, William Wallace has, already become a legend, like a Robin Hood character, in the aftermath of Stirling Bridge. And so he needs to defrock and destroy.
Yes, he's another symbol.
He's another symbol that needs to be destroyed. So he is brought all the way to London and taken to Westminster Hall, right at the heart of power. And here he is tried for treason and atrocities against civilians. And there's this, just one little element where he says, never in my life have I sworn allegiance to him. Well, when I was doing my research for this stream, I was looking again at the use of the Lord Paramount, how he was making all of the Scottish nobility swear on this.
He probably had at some point.
Probably had sworn at him, but again, he probably fought for him already during the Welsh Wars. So this whole element that, again, he was had no sort of prior relationship with the king, and it was all hostile, always hostile. There was no collaboration. He never did a Robert the Bruce. No. He consistently did that before the outbreak of Bannock. From what we know about him, from what little we do know about him, it's obvious to assume that he had some form of direct subordination to the king with his wars. But nevertheless, that's another little element which doesn't really make any sense if you look at it historically.
So he's taken to London. Would you like to go over what happens to him there?
Yes, if you want to.
Yes. Okay. So I mean, essentially, he's taken there after this trial. And then he's taken to, oh God, no, it's not Smithfield. It's far too early for that. But he's taken to the place of execution, and he is publicly hung, drawn, and quartered. Essentially, funnily enough, this is one of the areas in the film where they do pull a punch, and they again, in this scene, they sort of hamper the cruelty of the English and make it out to be not as bad as it was. He was hung. He was hung publicly, but not. He was hung until the point of death. He was close to death. Then they let him down. And then they strapped him down. I think they disemboweled him. Then they chopped off his genitals. And then they beheaded him. Of course, in the film, you don't really see any of this. He's hung and stretched. And then he, whilst he's lying there, he screams freedom as Edward is dying. and as
again, it needs to be noted, William Wallace died in 1305, Longshanks died in 1307. So again, that's just complete nonsense. And
I think the princess is whispering in Edward's ear that the child she's carrying is all this nonsense. So yes, and then I think he was quartered. His body was chopped into 4 pieces, and they were sent to the 4 corners of England as a warning, essentially.
Well, just to illustrate the ruthlessness of Edward, this was a novel punishment that had been instituted by Edward to deal with treason. And again, just putting this in comparison, putting this in the context of all the weak kings that had preceded him. Someone in the chat mentioned, he was the influence behind Tywin Lannister. Yes, He was the
I
inspiration
could see that, certainly.
behind
Yes.
Tywin Lannister. He inherits a weak position from a weak father, and he uses the ancient claims of lordship and imposes them through iron will, ruthlessness, and brilliance in many senses. And the idea of this unique form for treason in particular, and displaying all these courted elements, in this case across the major towns of Scotland, is again intending to show a clear message. What happens to traitors. So at the one hand, the king is a great lawmaker in the sense that he creates the model parliament. He's a great builder in the sense that he creates the Carnarvon Castle, which again is modeled on the Theodosian walls in Constantinople, identifying his imperial ambitions. And then you have this element where he's prepared to use absolute vicious methods in order to dispatch his rivals, and again constantly using conscious symbolism such as the removal of the Stone of Scone. All of these elements talk about the actual depiction of Edward as ruthless, completely true. However, the depiction by McGowan, which of course I particularly like, is still taken a bit too far to make him even more ridiculous than that, even more ruthless than he really was. Yes. Especially when it comes to throwing his son's implied lover out of a window, defenestrating him.
Though of course there is I suppose the film does, in a sense, of course the story about the parentage of Edward III is nonsense, and all of this is madness, but there is a certain irony in that, as you say, Edward inherited a kingdom from his weak father, and he made all of these massive exertions, as we've discussed here. But then he had to pass it on to a weak son. Regardless of his sexuality or what have you, Edward II was quite ineffectual, and ran into many problems, to say the least.
Absolutely, and this is the final element of the film, which isn't particularly relevant to the story of Braveheart, because the story of Braveheart is over, apart from the myth of Braveheart, which we've gone into quite extensively with the story of Blind Harry and the subsequent records of him. But of course, the portrayal of the film is that we have Bannockburn, we have a weak and pathetic, again, Robert the Bruce, willing to subjugate Scotland again to the English, and then it's the memory of William Wallace that causes the Scottish, in an unpremeditated fashion, to fight for freedom at that battle.
I think there's even a wee moment where Robert the Bruce reaches into his gauntlet and takes out, a little piece of tartan fabric, which I think came from Wee Murren, and
Not a Wee
this
Murren.
evocative music starts playing, and then there's even this terribly I don't know, cringe, I suppose, line at the end where they say they fought like warrior poets, they fought like Scotsmen and won their freedom. I can feel you seething over there.
Now let me illustrate what actually happened, rather than Bannockburn being some sort of, I don't know, remembrance, or some sort of some sort of remembrance of the heroic actions of William Wallace. Like we said, what happens after with Robert the Bruce? Robert Bruce seizes the throne by murdering his main political rival, John Comyn, at the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, and then moves on from that point to crown himself in Scone and instantly begin a renewed conflict against the English. Now that John Balliol, I think John Balliol is dead at this point, or at least he's basically relinquished any chance that he will ever become King of Scotland again. He is now earnestly fighting to throw off the shackles for Edward I. And of course, to help in that endeavour, Edward I, of course, dies a year later. Nevertheless, one of the last acts of Edward I is actually to drive him from the Scottish mainland. Bruce is forced into exile rather briefly, but then he comes back and begins capturing.
Think, does the Bruce not have relations in Ireland? I think he goes to Ireland briefly.
Yes, and he comes back and he begins to capture important castles such as Roxburgh and Edinburgh. And the English are, throughout this entire time, there is a constant warfare. The English are constantly losing their grip over the country. And when you talk to Bannockburn isn't some moment where the Scottish finally realize they want to become free again due to the memory of William Wallace. Bannockburn is the culmination of a relentless 8-year campaign by the Bruce to establish his dominion over Scotland. And of course, he wins that battle, and Scotland establishes itself firmly as an independent kingdom again, even though there are attempts by Edward II, completely incompetent king to try and, assert that domination. It's unsuccessful, and from that point on, we have the continuation of an independent Scotland all the way up until
the Union.
The Union, the Act of Union. Again, a couple of issues in the 17th century when dealing with that, but nevertheless, a completely different story.
A couple, just a couple, but
again, completely different from that portrayal in that film. So, hopefully, before we get into the super chats, we've thoroughly debunked virtually every single element of that film. I think in terms of trying to understand
it, the bubble thoroughly burst.
I think in terms of trying to understand it, I wouldn't mind the film if it was a fantasy. If the English weren't the English, if there was some sort of, I don't know, like, Game of Thrones-esque enemy. But even then, they would be so dumbed down, oversimplified, and one side is so overly sympathetic, and one side is so overly sort of villainous. Even then, even as a film, I mean, because I understand some rudiments of creative writing, fiction writing, I know that Murren is going to die. Even before watch the film. It's so a very obvious.
Predictable film, isn't it?
The whole first act is predicated around making this incredibly sympathetic situation to manipulate the audience, to lull you in before they pull the rug under you and destroy it, and give Mel Gibson all the motivation he needs to wreak havoc on the evil, the evil, irredeemable English.
I mean, I suppose besides the sort of very clear anti-Anglo sentiment, which is there, I suppose also it's a fundamental idea that with a Hollywood movie, you need someone to root for, right? And if we look at the actual story, when we look at the actual history, it's very shades of grey. There's a lot of opportunism and cruelty on either side.
In terms of comparison, I mean, one of the other comparisons I point to is one of my favorite films, Master and Commander, because
it's a wonderful film.
Because Master and Commander, of course, they're against the Americans. They're not against the French like they were portrayed in that film. Hence, why the Acheron actually doesn't make any sense, because it's a Boston-made ship. It's based on the US's Constitution, and the whole basis of that is that we need a baddie. We'll make it the French, because the Americans can't be a baddie, and what we're basically aiming for the American market. And sadly, even then, making that concession, the film didn't do very well financially. But the point is, the French weren't made into this insane, diabolical Bond-esque villain like the English were in this film.
No, there's actually a bit of sort of chivalry, isn't there?
Yes. Well, there's a bit of betrayal as well at the end, but even
typical French.
but even at the end, my point is the French are clearly the enemy, but they're not caricatures of the French. They're still formidable, and you can recognize them as basically existing historically, even though that that film is, again, as you mentioned, is not the whole fiction is actually turned on its head, because it's not the French, it's the Americans. But in this film, it is the fact they are creating a fantasized, again, evil variation of the English, and he does this again with the Patriot.
Yes, there's even very similar lines in both of those films. Give me an opportunity to kill an Englishman and all this.
Yes, yes, I'll have an opportunity to kill some more redcoats. Just all of these elements. And I mean, if anyone's asking me to do the Patriot, I can't do this anymore. I can't put myself through. I can't put myself through watching the Patriot. I mean, if someone paid me a vast amount of money, then maybe, but watching Braveheart again, really took it out of me. So without further ado, we'll get into the super chats.
Are you going to read out, did you manage to get these super chats from last time that we missed?
Yes, I will read out the super chats from last time, but oh dear, no.
Oh, has it happened again?
Well, okay, right. Oh dear. Okay, right. What's happened is that I was expecting, sorry, just give me a second. I was expecting the super chats to, because I can still see the most recent super chats in my super chat activity sticker thing, but for some reason I can't scroll down either. So the first super chat I can see is from Jacob for $5. So if I can remember what those super chats are, because I did actually look at them before going on the stream. One of them was, oh God, who was it by? Talking about, what was it, Stalin's War, and whether I had read other works by the author of Stalin's War. I can't quite remember his name at the moment. But yes, this author also wrote a book on the Russian origins of the First World War. I'm just trying to remember, but anyway, someone's saying, AA apparently had this problem as well. Well, all I can do is see the most recent super chat. So the latest one I can see is by Jacob for $5, and I can read this one, but I can't read anyone's before that. So no, I haven't been able to access the super chats because the see all button is still disabled. And Charlemagne's mentioned in the chat, yes, it's Sean McKeon, and yes. Do check out his work. I mean, it's beautifully written, even though historically there are some contentious elements of it. And someone else, was it Marcus58, sent a super chat saying good work and all that. So thank you very much. Again, I'll try and find these super chats at some point, but do bear in mind I can't see them. There's no way for me to access them unless I go back and watch the stream.
At least we're not the only ones running into this problem, eh?
Yes. So the first super chat I can see from Jacob for $5, and again, if anyone has sent a super chat before this, and I'm not reading it out, do send another one, so I can not send another one. Just say you sent a super chat, so I can read it.
Yes, send us more money.
Right, Andrew Cooper for Jacob. Feck James III. Okay, great work as always, Pastelica. Okay, if you want if you hate James III, I mean, at least James III didn't die in battle against the English like James IV did. So at least he's got that going for him. Andrew Cooper for £20. So thank you very much, Andrew Cooper. That's very generous. More epic AM rants, please. Thanks both. Legendary stream. Well,
don't worry, I'll talk him into the Patriot. Don't worry.
Thank you very much, Andrew Cooper. And I'm sorry about this, but there's really nothing I can do. I can only see the last 6 super chats I've been sent, so I can't even refresh it. So I've got to read these ones through. Okay, White Raven 7278 for $10. Came in late, but I'll be listening through. Your streams are a godsend for long drives through the Midwest. The streams on Germany and Austria educated me, and passages on some great history were wonderful. Thank you very much for that,
I
White
can only
Raven.
imagine those long drives,
Yes, and of course we will be talking about Austrian history when we come back on Monday. We'll be starting with the Anatomy of Austria series. So yes, so hopefully you can enjoy that as well. So thank you very much, White Raven. Narco Republican for $2. Cathartic rant. What's your blood pressure though? Yes, these rants do sort of take a lot out of me. I think again, I don't tend to enjoy watching historical films because of this. I mean, sometimes there are films where they really make an effort. I mean, one I was talking about before we went on stream with Columba was The Death of Stalin, which is just a wonderful film because if you know enough about Stalin, you can just pick up on all of these little elements which resonate. It's
also very funny. So
well, yes, it has that going for it. Even though I was quite disappointed by Michael Palin, but next time. Great Michael Palin fan, but nevertheless, there are huge elements of that film. Even the Mozart concerto, I think it's the 23rd concerto, the Adagio, which is played at the beginning. Only sort of Stalin buffs will know from the beginning that was Stalin's favorite piece of music. All of these little elements, even though there's of course a bit of historical contrivance to fit it into a theatrical plot.
But you can tell that the makers of the film are really have a passion for the area as opposed to just using it for Hollywood bucks,
Absolutely, and I think it was very true to the spirit of the history, if not true to
remarkably considering the film.
So it is possible to make a historical film that I enjoy, but if you create something like Braveheart, I'm going to hate you. I'm sorry to say that. I think this film has not only dumbed everyone down, but it's been responsible for a lot of rise in modern English. I mean, it's created over 25 years ago, and I think it was responsible for much of recent Anglophobia coming out of Scotland.
Yes,
and again,
I can attest to that. I mean, there are so many Scottish people who have voted SNP based on that film, and I'm not even trying to exaggerate or be facetious. And I remember, the amount of people I know who went to a crappy state school and were shown this film in school. They're shown this film in school, and it's just, and you don't get the other side of the story. You don't get taught about the geopolitics. It's just, it's part of this crude nationalist play which ignores centuries of history. But hey,
yes, I was never shown Braveheart at school. I was shown Kingdom of Heaven at school, which is
you could do worse. You could do worse.
which has some completely ridiculous and stupid elements. I mean, that might be an interesting film to debunk if we ever get around to doing the Crusades as a topic. But
that'd be a good one. Yeah. I need to
Judge,
watch the extended edition. People tell me it's far better than the original.
yes,
But,
yes, I have with the fundamental flaw with that film. I mean, I've watched both, and I mean, from an aesthetic point of view, the score in terms of the cinematography, in terms of the set design, in terms of the costumes, it's all wonderful. But the issue with that film is that it all hinges on Orlando Bloom's character, which is nonsense. Kind of like the character of Mel Gibson. It's a fish out of water story, and it's complete fictionalization of a great historical character, which is Balin of Ibelin, which again makes no sense within the context. But again, that's a different stream. So
yes.
Judge Caligula Bushman for €5. Thank you very much. I sense a new series coming to light, a historical media catharsis, two historians foaming at the mouth watching Hollywood period pieces. Well, the problem with that, Judge Caligula Bushman, is that it takes too much out of me.
Yes,
sadly.
it's a question of stamina, my friend.
So, I mean, even watching this last night, I mean, I was up to 2:00 in the morning watching this. It just, I mean, at least I'm passionate about it. I wasn't just, it wasn't boring to watch, but it was infuriating to watch, to say the least. John Boy for €10. Thank you very much. Thanks for debunking a film that my wife loves. I can't wait to tell her it's rubbish.
Thanks, John. Glad we could be of service.
Wonderful. And hopefully your wife will become a fast fan of this channel after that as well. So thank you very much, John Boy. Right, I'll refresh and hopefully I will be able to see all the subsequent super chats because there are quite a few tonight. We don't usually get this many super chats. Yes, I can see the new ones now.
Hatred and rage seem to be a good look for you, eh?
Oh dear. Yes, well, as you can tell, I'm usually quite passive and studious and exerting this academic air. But no, when it comes to something ridiculous like a Mel Gibson Hollywood American movie, yes, that does get my goat. Jacanda Plus for $2. I don't really want to say that, Jacanda Plus. But thank you for the money anyway. But no, I won't say that. 99, that's the first one I've actually had to reject, by the way, Jacanta Plus. So
well, then he must have done a real number.
99 Iron Duke for $5 says, you and your guests have the best historical channel on YouTube. Well, thank you very much, 99 Iron Duke. I'm really not sure about that. I mean,
yes, I would contest that myself, but it means a lot. It does.
That's very kind of you, but I definitely will contest that. I mean, ultimately we just do, even if you find the streams interesting, I mean, there are tons of channels with, far more backing and resources than us that at least, on some sort of superficial level are able to, give like animated renditions, all these interactive elements, make a history documentary like a movie. I mean, sadly, I don't have the talent or the resources to do that. So unless I do, and I can, write a typed script as opposed to the free flowing sort of podcast style we're doing at the moment, then maybe we can qualify, but hopefully one day. But for now,
we need a patron. We need a patron.
Absolutely. Karen took the kids for €5. Says, any chance of doing some Irish history, possibly the 1916 Rising? Thanks for the streams. Yes, I mean, I know very little about early Irish history in particular, but I wouldn't mind doing it. I mean, I've done a lot of videos on this channel where I was a novice to the subject and very much enjoyed.
Yeah, me too. Come to mention it.
Yes, very much enjoyed. All of the new and interesting perspectives, encountering this area of history. So possibly, but I will emphasize that in terms of like the list of projects, it's already very, very long. So maybe a specific episode, like a heterodox episode on Aemon de Valera or some sort of figure from that period, or Michael Collins. But in terms of like a long strew of Irish history, I mean, I've already been petitioned to do one on Polish history and Finnish history and Spanish history.
Everybody wants theirs, but I mean, we are planning at some point to get to a sort of series on the British Isles, aren't we?
Yes, we're one of the series we're going to do seriously is the Children of Albion, which will focus on the British Isles from. I mean, I'm not sure when to start it, but traditionally possibly from 410 when the Romans leave, and 1485, which is
Look
the
to
Battle
your
of
own
Bosworth.
defences. Yes.
Yes, which is the Battle of Bosworth Field. So yes, and I don't really want to do one on later English history. That's a slightly different topic I want to get into. But early English history, yes, absolutely.
Yes, and it gets increasingly spicy, shall we say, as we get closer to modernity.
Marcus 588 for $8 says, sadly, no furious to put on a Scots accent and quote spears long as a man. Yes, well,
I mean, it's funny, all of that. I mean, you know the line where he's making that speech before the battle, and he's talking about thunderbolts coming out of his butt and what have you.
Oh yes,
I mean,
yeah. William Wallace is 7 feet tall. Yeah. Well, elements like that. The ridiculous thing about that film is it consciously knows that the source material it's taking this from is ridiculous.
Yes, because
So
that is in Blind Harry and stuff. There's
Yes.
this idea that he's this 7 foot tall giant, you know.
So these elements are actually in the Wallace, yet at the same time it takes the rest of the Wallace as gospel. But oh no, we can't make Mel Gibson, an extra 2 feet or sorry, 1.5 feet sort of taller.
Yes.
That'll be going too far.
Prosthetics, yes.
Just have him on stilts. That'll be quite fun.
I'd enjoy that, yeah.
But great work and cathartic debunk here, guys. Shame because Mel is based. Regarding whether Mel is based or not, I mean, obviously he made. I have never actually watched Passion of the Christ, so I wouldn't be able to tell you or give like an overview of that film.
He has made some pretty controversial comments after drinking and driving. I've heard comments I will not repeat.
Yes, and of course there are certain elements, certain comments regarding a certain group of people which were spawned mainly from the film The Passion of the Christ. Whether that actually qualifies as based, because like we described here, despite I think,
who is he making all these films for?
I know he's making them. He's just making them for the the dumb American masses. And when we're talking about this film in particular, I mean, there is a inexplicable. I mean, talk about prima nocta. Even if I think he's a Catholic, taking a prima nocta and inserting it earnestly into a medieval setting destroys so much of the moral impetus of the Catholic Church in the medieval period, because it makes it all seem like the Catholic Church is either impotent or turns a blind eye to this sort of thing, which is ridiculous either way. So even implicitly, if he's trying to push that message through, and the fact that he's portraying all nobles in such a I have to say either very unsympathetic 21st century American bent, or again a Marxist bent, is up for debate. But nevertheless, there are elements of Mel Gibson's work which you really have to question whether he is based, quote unquote. But then again, I'm sure that term is quite liberally applied.
Oh, it is, yes.
D's Bit of Rough for £2.
I laugh at that name every time. I can't help it. Why do people give themselves these names?
Great stream, guys. P.S. Angry AM is best AM. Ooh. Well, thank you, D's Bit of Rough. I'm not sure how long I can. I mean, I'm already tired, as you can see. I'm not sure how long I can keep up Angry AM. But yes. Well, thank you for the feedback. But I'm wondering if I can sort of introduce this element into my historical reading. No, I don't think so. I think I'm too boring otherwise. No, you have to. Anyway,
not at all.
Oh, I don't know. I think I'm quite boring. Anyway, 99 Iron Duke for $5 says, Apostolic Majesty, please cover Alfred the Great. Well, we'll do on this series. It's part of the period. He's a crucial figure to understand. So yes, in addition to Alfred the Great, we'll also be going over the Dane Law. We'll be covering the Seven Kingdoms. We'll be talking about Mercia,
Heathen Army, and
the Great Heathen Army. We'll be talking about Athelstan. We'll be talking about the War of the Roses. All of these elements. So hopefully you'll enjoy that if it comes. I mean, as we've been talking about, there are so many projects down the line, and sadly, I only have so much time. And of course, I'm taking my break at the beginning of September, so things will be slightly delayed. Another super chat from Judge Caligula Bushman for €10. Thank you very much. Going on a school trip to Scotland, the first thing our Edinburgh guide said was, All you Dutch folk know about Scotland is based on the film Braveheart. Let me burst your bubble. It's total bollocks. Oh, wonderful. I'm very happy.
Base tour guide.
I'm very happy to hear that. So thank you very much. Well, there's just one element. Has anyone else, before, I think it was Jacob, given a super chat? Because I can't go back and see any of my previous super chats, sadly. So if anyone has any super chats which I haven't read out, please send them. And in terms of the people from the previous stream, I am sorry that I haven't been able to access those super chats. I sort of semi-remembered them, but I'm sure that's not good enough. So when I have actual access to them, I'll endeavor to read them out eventually.
Indeed.
But for now, Susan Wojcicki and Infinite Wisdom has decided to make it impossible for me to read more than the 6 most recent super chats at one time. So
useless. Useless.
So thank you, Susan. But please, for the sake of my wonderful audience, do amend that feature so we can actually read the super chats next time.
Or else.
Wonderful. So yeah, that's unless you have anything concluding remarks to say about the wonderful film and how much we love Mel Gibson, Columba. Anything you want to share?
I would say it's better than Apocalypto. That would be my concluding remark. But
Judge Clicker Bushman said that was my previous super chat. Well, thank you very much for sending yet another super chat, Judge Clicker Bushman.
What a trooper! What a trooper!
Wonderful. John Paleologus, did you send a super chat? Is that a super chat? Opinions on the movie Outlaw King? I can't tell because you said that quite a few times.
Funnily enough, Outlaw King. I won't get into it, but one of my friends was actually an extra in that. Believe it or not.
Oh really?
Get that Netflix bucks,
I've never watched it, so I have to take. I mean, there are quite a few interesting things on Netflix popping up at the moment, but I seldom have the time. And like I said, I get very angry from watching historical
Indeed.
series and films. So if anyone can give me, a wonderful sort of review of some of these things, I will sort of go and watch them. But like I said, sadly, I just don't tend to enjoy most historical things. So anyway, thank you very much to everyone for watching. Thank you very much to all of the wonderful super chatters. Thank you in general to my patrons listed here. If you would like to contribute to the channel on a regular basis, there is a link in the description. Other than that, Columba, anything you want to say before we depart?
No, my friend, I think we've covered it pretty well. Nothing to show.
Wonderful. So just a reminder to everyone that next Monday we will be back and we will be discussing the anatomy of Austria. We'll be introducing that topic next week. And just to quickly check my subscribe star to see who won the competition for the next episode of Heterodox. Last time, I believe it was Nicholas II. So let's have a look. Yes. So the next episode in 2 weeks' time will be on Nicholas II of Russia, and that will conclude our series on the Fall of Eagles, covering off Russia. So look forward to that on the 25th of August. Other than that, thank you all very much for listening. Thank you very much to Columba for being such a wonderful contributor to the stream, and good night.
Night, everyone.